New Jersey, 1958, studio session. John Coltrane walks into the control room at Rudy Van Gelder's studio and asks the engineer to stop. Not because something's wrong with the sound, because something's wrong with him. He's just recorded an album in a single afternoon. Standards, ballads, intimate pieces he's been carrying for years. The kind of playing that doesn't hide anything. No sheets of sound to duck behind. No harmonic experiments to obscure what he's saying. Just Coltrane, exposed, and he doesn't want it released. Prestige Records owns the session. They'll release it anyway. But Coltrane will spend the next phase of his career trying to distance himself from what he recorded that day, even as critics and musicians slowly realize he captured something unrepeatable. This is the story of an album a man tried to bury, and why the world wouldn't let him. By 1958, John Coltrane was in transition. He'd survived his heroin addiction, kicked it cold in his mother's house in Philadelphia the year before, locking himself away until his body stopped demanding what was killing him. He'd worked with Miles Davis, been fired by Miles for the addiction, then brought back once he got clean. But he was still under contract to Prestige Records, a small independent jazz label that had signed him before Miles, before sobriety, before anyone thought John Coltrane would become John Coltrane. Prestige wanted product. They needed sessions to fulfill his contract before he moved to the bigger Atlantic Records deal waiting on the other side. So they scheduled a day at Rudy Van Gelder's studio in Hackensack. A modest session, standards and ballads, nothing experimental, just Coltrane playing beautiful, accessible jazz with a small group. The lineup was intimate. Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Donald Byrd on trumpet for some tracks, and the brilliant young bassist George Joyner filling in. This wasn't meant to be a statement album, it was meant to be a contractual obligation, but Coltrane showed up that day carrying more than a playlist. The session starts clean. Coltrane and the group move through Like Someone in Love, professional, controlled, the kind of playing any competent jazz musician could deliver. Then they get to Lush Life, Billy Strayhorn's composition, a song about disillusionment, about watching love curdle into loneliness, about the gap between who you thought you'd be and who you became. Coltrane plays it alone. Just him and the rhythm section. No trumpet to share the weight. And something shifts. His tone doesn't soar. It aches. The runs aren't virtuosic displays. They're confessions he can't say in words. In the control room, engineer Rudy Van Gelder notices Coltrane's body language change. He's not performing anymore. He's remembering. Later, Red Garland would recall that Coltrane seemed somewhere else during those ballads. Not absent, hyper-present, but to a place the rest of them couldn't see. The session wraps in a few hours. Efficient. Complete. Coltrane leaves the studio and immediately feels wrong about it. The problem wasn't the playing. The problem was what the playing revealed. Coltrane had spent years behind heroin, behind the blur of addiction, behind the role of sideman in other people's bands. Now sober, now stepping toward his own voice, he just recorded an album that sounded like grief. Not the triumphant comeback narrative, not the virtuoso announcing his arrival. Just a man dealing with what it cost to get clean. The title track, Lush Life, was too exposed. The ballad playing was too vulnerable. These weren't the tracks of someone hiding behind technique. They were the tracks of someone who couldn't hide anymore. And Coltrane wasn't ready for people to hear that. Bob Weinstock, the head of Prestige, didn't see the problem. He had a beautiful session, pristine recording, strong performances, exactly what the label needed. But Coltrane pushed back. He asked them to delay it, to reconsider, to maybe not release it at all. Prestige had contractual rights. They'd paid for the session. They owned the masters. The album was going out whether Coltrane wanted it to or not. Here's what Coltrane couldn't explain to the label. He was about to explode. In the months following that session, he would record Giant Steps, an album of such staggering harmonic complexity, it would redefine what jazz improvisation could be. He was moving toward sheets of sound, toward spiritual intensity, toward a version of John Coltrane the world would recognize as revolutionary. And Lush Life sounded like the opposite of that. It sounded small, fragile, human in a way he wasn't ready to be public about. But Prestige moved forward. They scheduled the release for late 1960, 2 years after it was recorded, once Coltrane had already left the label and established himself elsewhere. By the time Lush Life hit shelves, Coltrane was already a different artist. And the album landed like a ghost from a past he'd been trying to outrun. 1960, John Coltrane is now a name. Giant Steps has been released. His work with Miles on Kind of Blue is already canonical. He's leading his own legendary quartet. And suddenly, here comes Lush Life, an album recorded in a single afternoon 2 years ago, full of standards and ballads that sound nothing like the Coltrane currently reshaping modern jazz. The initial reaction is confusion. Critics don't know what to do with it. Some praise the technical skill but note it feels restrained, almost tentative compared to his recent work. Others dismiss it as a contractual throwaway, filler material Prestige is cashing in on now that Coltrane's famous. One review describes it as pleasant but unremarkable. The track Lush Life gets attention for Coltrane's sensitive interpretation of Strayhorn's composition, but even that feels like a sidebar to his more explosive recent recordings. Fans buying the album expecting Giant Steps Part 2 are baffled. This doesn't sound like the future of jazz. It sounds like a man saying goodbye to something. Coltrane rarely talked about Lush Life in interviews. When asked, he was polite but distant, acknowledging it existed, but steering conversation back to his current projects. For years, the album lived in a strange purgatory. Not forgotten, but not celebrated either. It was the Coltrane album people owned but didn't play. The one that came up in discographies but not in conversations about his genius. And for Coltrane, that was fine. He'd moved on. His career was ascending toward a love supreme, toward free jazz, toward a spiritual intensity that would make him one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. But among a small circle of musicians and obsessive jazz listeners, something different was happening. Quietly, people kept returning to Lush Life. Not for the fireworks, not for the innovation, for the honesty. It started with other saxophonists. Players who'd studied Giant Steps and tried to match Coltrane's harmonic velocity began noticing something in the Lush Life session they'd missed before. The control. The space. The fact that Coltrane could strip his playing down to almost nothing and still communicate everything. By the 1970s, after Coltrane's death, critics began revisiting his entire catalog with fresh ears, and Lush Life started to feel less like a detour and more like a confession. Jazz historian Lewis Porter would later describe the album as essential for understanding Coltrane's emotional range. The fact that his genius wasn't just harmonic complexity, but the ability to use restraint as a form of intensity. The title track, Lush Life, became quietly revered among ballad players. Not flashy, not the track you'd use to demonstrate technique, but the track you'd listen to when you wanted to understand what it meant to play with absolute vulnerability. Here's what Lush Life proved: that an artist's reluctance doesn't determine an album's worth. That the work we're most afraid to share is sometimes the work that matters most. Coltrane spent his career chasing transcendence, through harmonic innovation, through spiritual seeking, through relentless experimentation. But Lush Life captured something he couldn't replicate later. The sound of a man who just survived himself, playing with nothing left to prove and everything left to process. It influenced a generation of ballad players who realized you didn't have to choose between technical mastery and emotional nakedness. And it became a quiet touchstone for artists navigating the gap between who they were and who they were becoming. Modern saxophonists still study the album, not for the runs, but for the pauses. For what Coltrane chose not to play. Lush Life is not John Coltrane's most important album. It's not his most innovative, most acclaimed, or most influential, but it might be his most human. It's the album that reminds us genius isn't just about what you invent, it's about what you're willing to reveal. Coltrane tried to bury this record because it showed him in transition, uncertain, still figuring out who he'd become after surviving what almost killed him. But that's exactly why it endures. Because every artist has a Lush life moment. A piece of work that feels too raw, too early, too honest. And sometimes those are the recordings that outlast everything else. Not because they were perfect, but because they were true.